Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Chau Chak Wing Museum. Welcome to our very first event for 2023. We have a very exciting program of talks, seminars, and other activities, which I'll talk about in a moment. Firstly, I would like to begin by acknowledging that we are meeting today on Gadigal land, the unceded land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and that the Chau Chak Wing Museum and the University of Sydney more broadly wishes to pay respect and acknowledge the traditional custodians of the past and present. My name's Craig Barker too, by the way, for anyone who doesn't know me. The Chau Chak Wing Museum, as I mentioned before, is embarking on a really exciting program of events throughout 2023. And I would encourage you to visit our website to see what's coming up. And I'll briefly mention a couple of events in a moment. But if anyone is not a member of the Chau Chak Wing Museum Members Organisation, I would also strongly encourage that you consider joining as well for discounts on a range of activities, but also a number of very specific museum members-only events, including on the 9th of February, when we have a wonderful little soiree planned for the new exhibition upstairs. We've also got a range of talks programmed both lunchtime, like this one, and also Thursday evenings to look forward to, and a range of children's activities beginning next Saturday with a Chinese paper cutting workshop to mark the Lunar New Year, the Year of the Rabbit, and on the 4th of February, a rabbit children's activity as well. But today, it is my great pleasure and honour to introduce our speaker. Associate Professor Lorenzo Calvelli is a lecturer and researcher at the University of Venice, earning his PhD in 2005. Lorenzo's research interests focus on ancient history and classical epigraphy, the use of the past, the history of classical scholarship, the study of forgeries, which is an area that I know you're working on considerably at the moment, and also more broadly on the potential of the digital humanities. I was going to recite a whole list of books that he's published, but I know he's talking about a number of them in the paper, so I won't do so. But I will point out that he is in Sydney for the 2023 Latin Summer School, and last week I know, I had the privilege of sneaking in on one of the classes actually for a short bit, and I know that the students participating were absolutely rapt with Lorenzo's engagement. It's exciting to be able to add on this public talk to your other teaching commitments while you've been in Sydney briefly as well. Cyprus is the focus of today's presentation, and Lorenzo is a major contributor to our understanding of the ancient history of Cyprus, including with fieldwork involved with the Ayia Napa research project, examining the church cave and monastery at Ayia Napa as well from fieldwork, but also, as we'll hear today, from a study of the epigraphy of the island as well. And I must say that from my perspective and that of many of the Paphos archaeological team, whom I know are in the room as well, we're very, very excited to hear your take on today's presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, Lorenzo Calvelli on the Roman conquest of Cyprus.
Good afternoon to everyone. To begin with, I would like to express my deepest gratitude to Craig Barker, to Candace Richards, and to all the staff, friends, and colleagues at the Chau Chak Wing Museum, but also the University of Sydney, Paul Roach, Catherine Wedge, Francis Muki, for kindly inviting me here, both to deliver this lecture and also, for being such wonderful hosts during my stay here in Australia. I'm really happy to be here. And I'm also honored to be able to talk about my research in front of this audience. I think that many of you are probably familiar with the Paphos Theatre archaeological project, which is an outstanding excavation project in Western Cyprus led by the University Museum in Sydney, and has really involved hundreds of archaeologists and students over the years. So I hope that the talk that I will give today will be at least a little beneficial for understanding the historical framework that marked the official entrance of Cyprus into the Roman world. But in the first place, please allow me to introduce shortly my relationship with Cyprus, my personal relationship. This may come as a bit of a romantic touch from my side, but I think that it is important to state how meaningful the sweet land of Cyprus, to quote the late medieval Cypriot chronicler Leontios Macheras, is for both my personal and scientific lives. So I first arrived at the University of Cyprus in Nicosia in autumn 1999. I was a young student at the time, an MA student who wanted to work on Roman Cyprus. Since then, I've literally fallen in love with the island, and I've never stopped studying Cypriot history and archaeology. So for my doctoral dissertation, I investigated the uses of the past during the Frankish and Venetian periods in Cyprus, and in particular, I studied the history of the early excavations in Cyprus carried out by the Venetians in the 16th century, and also the descriptions of Cypriot antiquities offered by pilgrims and travelers during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. Well, this is where Cyprus is, just to show. And yes, this was the topic of my first book, which was published in Venice in 2009. In more recent years, I have decided to focus especially on ancient Roman history and investigate more in detail the beginning of the relationship of the Romans with Cyprus. The results of my work were published during the pandemic, actually, in 2020, as a monograph entitled, in Italian, The Treasure of Cyprus, Clodius, Cato, and the Roman Conquest of the Island. This is also the first volume of a new series of books edited by the Ca' Foscari University Press, which are all accessible in full open access. This series is entitled Studi Cipriotti, and I'm delighted to be one of the directors of the series together with 3 other Italian colleagues. So please forgive this short and slightly commercial introduction, but I thought that it was important for you to understand where and when my Cypriot interests and activities began, and which are the main topics that I've been working on so far. So like I said, my interest on Cyprus began over 20 years ago, and I've thus been able to witness how the approach to Roman Cyprus, to this topic, has changed during the last 2 decades. In fact, while historiographical accounts, as the one offered by Ernst Badian in a seminal article published in the Journal of Roman Studies in 1965, may still be reckoned as crucial, the strategic role of the island, which after the Roman conquest became part of extensive commercial and administrative networks, had previously been underestimated. Until a few decades ago, it was quite common to label Cyprus as a silent and insignificant senatorial province of the Roman Empire. For instance, in 1980, the Scottish archaeologist Terence Bruce Mitford wrote that under the Romans, Cyprus entered upon more than 3 centuries of tranquil obscurity, seemingly not unprosperous and apparently well-governed. Only in recent years have scholars begun to explore the geohistorical context and the objects of material culture especially, that together with written sources can shed new light on the role of Cyprus as a Mediterranean hub, both in the Hellenistic and in the Roman times. Identity, insularity, connectivity have finally become buzzwords for all of us to signify the multiple interactions that occurred in Cyprus, not only during the prehistorical and archaic periods, this was already known, but like I said, also under the Ptolemies and the Romans. So when studying Roman Cyprus, the question naturally arises, how did it all begin? Most history books will tell you that the Roman conquest of Cyprus took place in 58 BCE, but they do not really go into further details. Yet, for a number of coincidences that are worth being explored, the quantity of ancient written sources that relate to this event and have survived to present is incredibly rich and diversified. Long accounts, as well as short notices, are offered by approximately 20 Greek and Latin authors, including Cicero, Livy, Strabo, Velleius Paterculus, Valerius Maximus, both Seneca the Elder and Seneca the Younger, Lucan, Pliny the Elder, Plutarch, Florus, Appian, Cassius Dio, Rufus Festus, Ammianus, as well as by some crucial late antique scholia, which are based on now lost classical texts such as Solo's histories. So, of course, literary narratives must also be combined with information provided by other kinds of sources, such as inscriptions, coins, papyri, juridical texts, and archaeological data, even if I must say that material evidence related to the first century BC Cyprus is not particularly abundant at the moment. Of all the literary authors which provide information on the Roman conquest of Cyprus, the only one who actually lived at the time of this episode of the conquest is Cicero. Yet almost everything that Cicero says about these events is heavily biased by his own perspective and personal experience. In fact, in the same month and year when Cyprus was declared by law to have become an official property of the Roman people, another law stated that Cicero had to be exiled from Rome. And the promoter of both these statutes was the tribune of the plebs, Clodius, whose actions were brutally criticized, of course, by Cicero in many of his surviving orations. We don't have any portraits of Clodius, so I just showed you the most recent and perhaps only monograph that exists on him in English. So two speeches in particular, the Domo Sua and the Processio, given respectively in September 57 and March 56 BCE, present the annexation of Cyprus as an unprecedented act of violence, through which a friendly king was dispossessed of his legal status and properties. Cicero's goal was clearly to parallel his own experience, his own position, his properties having also been confiscated when he was exiled, with that of the king of Cyprus, who, according to the Roman orator, had been deprived of his realm by an unlawful piece of legislation. Throughout these two speeches, Cicero uses his finest rhetorical weapons to convince his public that the annexation of Cyprus took place without any juridical grounds, and that Clodius had obliged the Romans to act against the bonds of friendship that existed between Rome and the Ptolemies, the Greek dynasty that at the time ruled over Egypt and Cyprus and who had ruled over the island for over 2 centuries. Yet, if we want to seek freedom from the Ciceronian point of view of the, let's call it, Cyprus issue, we must deconstruct his rhetorical narrative. The first way to do so is to produce a as precise as possible, chronological framework for the events related to the decision of annexing Cyprus to the Roman Republic. So by combining this rich body of sources that we have, it is possible to reconstruct a precise sequence of dates, of events. And this is quite amazing, because if you think that we're talking about events that took place more than 2,000 years ago, I mean, this is not always the case when we deal with ancient history. So let's have a look at this slide. First, between late February and the end of the intercalary month, we're still in the pre-Julian period of 58, Clodius promulgated and passed a law which included 3 specific points: the confiscation of Cyprus in the name of the Roman people, the publicatio in Latin, the auctioning of the royal properties, and their realization, meaning their conversion into cash. About a month later, around the 18th of March, Cicero left Rome because of another law that Claudio passed against him, and it was only after this event that Caesar too left Rome for going to Gaul, where he began his mandate as proconsul. So as you can see, many very well-known historical events took place within a few months at the beginning of 58 BC. And once again, we're really lucky to have so many sources that basically allow us to reconstruct what happened in Rome almost on a daily basis. But to go back to Cyprus, what were the reasons that prompted Clodius to promote the annexation of the island, and what was the juridical ground that allowed him to pass a law on this topic? Could the Romans just decide that Cyprus was theirs and incorporate it in their state without any legal justification? Ancient literary sources offer a variety of explanations. So, to begin with, Cicero simply presents Clodius's law as a result of the latter's personal ambition and as a violent and imperialistic act against a friendly sovereign. I'm not going to go through the passages, but you can have a look at them while I talk. And you will see that for Cicero, there is no real reason for which Cyprus was annexed. Causa incognita, he says, and so on. On the contrary, other authors, like Strabo, for instance, depict the king of Cyprus as greedy and ungrateful towards the Romans. Strabo also suggests that Ptolemy of Cyprus had played a role when Clodius had been kidnapped by the Cilician pirates about 10 years before the Roman conquest of the island in 67 BC. And the same information also appears in the works of Appian and Cassius Dio. In fact, to be honest, Cyprus's interaction with the activities of the pirates seems to be implied also by other sources, including the epigraphical text of the so-called Lex de Provincis Praetoris, dating to 100 BCE, and the Pro Flacco, an oration that Cicero himself had given just 1 year earlier in late 59 BCE. And also, especially, I would say, in a late scholium to Cicero's Pro Sestio, where you can see that the anonymous writer says, after Clodius brought forward the law, his kingdom, meaning the kingdom of Cyprus, was confiscated because it was said that the king of Cyprus used to support the pirates. This is very interesting in my view. Another group of authors, which you can see here, hint at an economic explanation for the annexation and refer to the legendary richness of the island as well as to the alleged poverty of the Roman people at the time. The latter is, of course, a literary cliché, which is not confirmed by other sources and contrasts with what we know about the enormous wealth that the Romans had been acquiring during the late Republic, especially thanks to Pompey's victories in the Eastern Mediterranean in the late 60s BCE, so very few years before the Roman conquest of Cyprus. Finally, but most interestingly, a group of scattered texts, one by Seneca the Younger, and then the anonymous author of the treatise on the Viris Illustribus, and some scholias, very late antique or even early medieval scholias to Lucan's poem, seem to offer a more plausible explanation for the Roman decision to confiscate Cyprus. All these bits of evidence probably derive from a lost work of the Roman historian Sallust, as explicitly referred by the third passage, for instance, the histories, which were written around 40 BCE and cover the period from 78 to 63 BCE. So they end with Pompey's conquest of the Eastern Mediterranean. All of these texts refer to the inheritance of a king who had bequeathed Cyprus to the Romans, giving them the right to incorporate the island into their own property. At this point, I believe that we should make some clarity on who was ruling Cyprus when Clodius passed his law in 58. So at the time, the king of the island was a member of the Ptolemaic dynasty, whose identity is not well known. we just have few coins that probably refer to him. He's referred to as Ptolemy, King of Cyprus, so we don't even have a nickname for him. But we know that he was the brother of Ptolemy the 12th, who is commonly called Auletes, or flute player, who was then king of Egypt and was the father of famous Queen Cleopatra the 7th. So both Ptolemies of Cyprus and Auletes were sons of Ptolemy the 9th, commonly known as Latirus, who had been deposed from his throne in 107 BCE and replaced by his younger brother Ptolemy the 10th. So in that year, in 107, Ptolemy the 9th was obliged to take refuge on Cyprus, where he kept on reigning until 88, so for about 20 years, when Ptolemy the 10th died, and Ptolemy the 9th went back to Egypt, where he also died in 80 BC. He was succeeded, as you can see, by Cleopatra Berenike III, who was his daughter. But at the time, the Romans were already managing Egyptian dynastic issues, so Cleopatra Berenike was obliged to marry her cousin, Ptolemy the 11th, who was a protege of the Roman dictator Sulla, and thus became king. Regrettably, the young monarch immediately murdered his wife and was in turn lynched by a mob in Alexandria. But before dying, this is the important point for us, he allegedly made a will in favor of the Roman people. So all this happened in less than 20 days in the summer of 80 BCE in Egypt, in Alexandria. And it was then that Egypt and Cyprus were assigned to the two brothers, to the two sons of Ptolemy the 9th, the two brothers, Ptolemy the 12th and Ptolemy of Cyprus. So please excuse this quite complicated genealogical presentation, but I think that it is crucial to have it in mind in order to understand the legal requirements of the Roman annexation of the island. In fact, both brothers, Ptolemy the 12th and Ptolemy of Cyprus, always had to deal with a clear legitimacy problem. And it is likely that none of them was actually a legitimate son to their father. So this is why, for instance, Ptolemy the 12th emphasized Philopator, Philadelphos has his two authentic epithets. Auletes is just a nickname which was used to mock him, the flute player. And like I said, we don't know if his brother, the king of Cyprus, ever adopted an official epithet. There is no evidence for that, unfortunately. What we know is that in 59 BCE, when Caesar was a consul, the Roman Senate finally, after more than 20 years, officially confirmed Ptolemy the 12th as king of Egypt, as well as a friend and ally, socius and amicus of the Roman people. In change, he, let's say, offered an enormous amount of money, spontaneously, apparently, 6,000 talents, equaling 36 million denarii, to Caesar and Pompey, who had secured that his recognition actually took place. This happened in the spring of 59 BCE, exactly 1 year before Clodius proposed this bill that declared the confiscation of Cyprus. So can we then suspect that there was a link between these two decisions of the Roman people and of the Roman authorities? In my view, yes. In fact, unlike his brother, Ptolemy of Cyprus never paid any sum to obtain his recognition as king. Suetonius in Latin says that Pompey and Caesar had extorted from one Ptolemy alone, uni Ptolemeo in Latin, the bribe, the sum of money. So it means that the other king didn't pay. And this could be also the reason why some ancient authors, like Valerius Maximus and Festus, depict the king of Cyprus as a greedy and avaricious person. Above all, the fact that he was never officially acknowledged by the Romans as king of Cyprus probably accounts, like I said, for the decision to remove him from his throne 1 year later in 58 BCE. So, to sum up what we have been saying so far, both Egypt and Cyprus were probably bequeathed to the Roman people in the testament of Ptolemy XI, who died in Alexandria in 80 BCE. For several decades, the Roman authorities were reluctant on whether or not they should accept his will. And this should also make us think on Roman imperialism. It wasn't as straightforward as we think of it. I mean, they could have taken Egypt, but they decided not to for a long time. For instance, in 65 BCE, an attempt to annex Egypt was carried out by Crassus and was probably supported by Caesar too, but was heavily criticized by Cicero in a law speech entitled De Rege Alexandrino. We just have some fragments that survive among the scholia. 2 years later, in 63 BCE, the agrarian bill proposed by the tribune Brollos, which implied the reduction of the Ptolemaic properties in Egypt to ager publicus, was also opposed by Cicero in his orations De Lege Agraria. So when Ptolemy XII was officially recognized as king of Egypt in the spring of 59, it was almost automatic that his brother should do the same. Yet he did not, for reasons that remain obscure, that we don't know. And he was thus removed from his throne in the following year. Ancient sources are clear in stating that Clodius's bill ordering the confiscation of Cyprus was different from the one which entrusted this task on Cyprus on Cato the Younger, with the status of pro quaestore pro praetore. It is interesting to note that the Cyprus issue, let's call it so, put together two protagonists of the Roman political scene, Clodius and Cato, who are traditionally depicted as antagonists and promoters of very different political views. Clodius is supposed to be a radical and the most populist leader of the Caesarian group, while Cato is usually portrayed as the immaculate representative of the Republican and conservative wing of the Senate. Yet it is clear that in the Eastern Mediterranean, Clodius and Cato shared multiple interests in a crucial area for Roman expansion and formed an unlikely and unexpected partnership. In fact, they were both moved by a general hostility towards Pompey. This is the key. And they opposed his monopolistic patronage in the region. So under this perspective, the Roman conquest of Cyprus saw Roman foreign policy shaped by internal political debate and the ambitions of the great personalities of the time. But how did the conquest actually took place? A thorough examination of the sources shows that Cato probably left Rome in the late spring of 58. Around the same time, this is also very interesting, a revolt broke out in Alexandria, evidently because the local population considered the Roman annexation of Cyprus as an attack on Egypt itself and as a political defeat of their own ruler. So Ptolemy XII had to flee from Alexandria and head towards Rome, where he would seek refuge for almost 3 years, until he finally received military support for his reinstallment as king of Egypt by Pompey. So, while Cato was going eastward, Ptolemy XII was going westward, and the two happened to meet in Rhodes, probably in the late summer of 58 BC. Their encounter is fully described in Plutarch's Life of Cato, which heavily relies on a lost biography of the latter written by his contemporary Monacius Rufus. Now, a recently discovered partial account of this episode is also offered by an extraordinary piece of evidence a fragment of historical papyrus from Oxyrhynchus, now kept in Oxford in the Sackler Library, and first published by Alan Bauman in 2009, so really not long ago. And this is an exciting document, which refers to the words that Cato allegedly addressed to Ptolemy in Rhodes. Its editor suggested that it could belong to the lost work of the Greek historian Timagenes, perhaps the Peri Basileon, while Christopher Pelling, another Oxford scholar, attributed the fragment to Munatius Rufus, so the source of Plutarch. It is also possible that the fragment belongs to Timagenes' work, who in turn may derive from Munatius. At any rate, the text indicates that Cato summoned Ptolemy when they were both in Rhodes and initially convinced him to go back to Alexandria. However, later, a certain Tryphon, a friend of Ptolemy, dissuaded him again, so that in the end, the Egyptian king eventually decided to go to Rome and seek help from Pompey, like I said. While he was in Rhodes, Cato sent to Cyprus a friend of his, possibly named Lucius Caninius Gallus, to check out the king's reaction to Rome's confiscation bill. Caninius allegedly tried to persuade the king not to make any resistance and offered him a sort of retirement, happy retirement, as priest at the sanctuary of Aphrodite in Paphos, in old Paphos, modern Kuklia. However, the king did not accept the proposal and committed suicide in a rather theatrical way, which is described by many different ancient authors in full detail. But according to Plutarch, Cato was not happy with Caninius' way of handling things in Cyprus, and therefore he sent his nephew, Brutus, the future assassin of Caesar, who at the time was conveniently staying in Pamphylia, so just north of Cyprus in southern Anatolia. And Brutus so immediately went to Cyprus. He reached the island before his uncle Cato and immediately began to assume the responsibility for collecting the assets of the late king of the island. Finally, as you can see, Cato also arrived at his final destination, probably just before the end of 58, when the sailing season closed. It is likely that he also settled down in Paphos, which was the capital city of the island under the Ptolemies. The following year, 57 BCE, was probably entirely occupied by the confiscation and auction of the king's properties. Unfortunately, sources do not provide much information on the nature of the goods of the royal household in Cyprus. The author who gives us more details is Pliny the Elder, who drew them from a pamphlet entitled Catonis Crimina, or De Catonis Criminibus, written by Metellus Scipio, a contemporary of Cato, who was highly critical towards the latter. So different passages from Pliny's Natural History that you can read here refer to the extravagant properties of the last Ptolemy of Cyprus, of the late Ptolemy of Cyprus. These included, for instance, poisonous aphrodisiac Spanish flies, called cantharides in Latin, ostrich grease, ostrich sweat, Babylonian dining room furniture, as well as the statue of a philosopher which Cato aptly did not sell, but brought back with him to Rome. We shouldn't forget that he was a Stoic, after all. So even if sources do not refer to them, it is likely that the king's properties also included some real estate. This is what I'm also interested in. In fact, the Ptolemies certainly owned large portions of landed property in Cyprus, which must have formed the core of the confiscated estates of the deposed king. However, documents seem to indicate that royal property in Cyprus was officially under the jurisdictions of the cities in whose territories they lay, and there is no trace of extraterritorial royal land. As Roger Bagnall pointed out several years ago, there were certain large estates There were certain larger states within the cora of the cities, but we do not know who their owners were. Some may have been prominent men in the Ptolemaic kingdom who received royal grants, but we do not know how much land the king considered to be at his disposal and whether this land was included in the land attached to the cities or was separate from it. Furthermore, it seems entirely plausible to believe that the celebrated copper mines of the island were also included among the assets confiscated by Cato. It is likely, though, that they were not alienated, they were not sold, but rather became part of the Roman public possessions. Evidence for this is offered by some epigraphical and also literary sources, which refer to slightly later periods. These include a famous inscription from Old Paphos, whose text is carved on a statue base dedicated to Aphrodite, of course. So in this text, we can see that the League of the Cypriots set up the statue for Potamon, son of Aegyptus, who was at the time antistrategos and in charge of the mines, as well as head of the local gymnasium in Paphos. In his recent edition of the alphabetic Greek inscription from Paphos, a French scholar, Jean-Baptiste Caillat, has persuasively demonstrated that all the inscriptions concerning the League of the Cypriots, the koinon to Kyprion, belong to the first period of the Roman domination of Cyprus, or to when the island was returned to Cleopatra by Caesar, and not, as Mitford, whom we have met at the beginning of my talk, thought, to the times between the kingdoms of Ptolemy X and Ptolemy XI. So they've been postponed. Their dating has been postponed. In particular, the text celebrating Potamon can probably be dated to the years between 48 and 30 BCE, and most likely to the very end of this period, so to the aftermaths of the Battle of Actium. Potamon was a member of a family which was strictly related with the Roman ruling class, and it is possible that he should be identified with a certain Gaius Iulius Potamon, so he would have received Roman citizenship at some point, who is attested by other inscriptions from Paphos, or that at least he was a relative of his. So according to this inscription, Potamon held the joint appointments of antistrategos, which means deputy governor, and epiton metallon, in charge of the mines, which is nowhere else attested. And this is extremely important because it shows that in the late Hellenistic or early Roman times, according to how we dated the inscription, the copper mines of Cyprus were run by the state. Also, as shown by a passage from Josephus's Jewish Antiquities, in 12 BCE, an exchange of gifts took place between Augustus, at the time Cyprus was Roman, of course, and King Herod of Judea. So the latter, Herod, allegedly received half the revenue from the copper mines of Cyprus and was entrusted with the management of the half. We don't know of the other half. We don't really understand precisely what Josephus means here. But according to a recent interpretation of the text by the Belgian ancient historian Hans Hauben, Josephus should mean that Herod was entrusted with the responsibility for and the maintenance of all the copper mines of the islands, taking half the revenue extracted from them. At any rate, it seems likely that the public acquisition of the mines had taken place already at the time of the annexation of the island carried out by Cato. According to Plutarch, the confiscation of the assets belonging to Ptolemy of Cyprus allowed Cato to accumulate the impressive total of nearly 7,000 talents of silver, equaling 42 million denarii, a sum which was higher than the bribe offered by his brother Ptolemy XII to Caesar and Pompey. So he should have better bribed than, well, just to say. if we keep in mind that according to Plutarch himself, the whole military campaign of Pompey in the Eastern Mediterranean had brought in 20,000 talents, not like one of the highest achievements of the Roman treasury, the outcome of the single auction of the Cypriot assets looks even more astonishing. In the late autumn of 57 BC, or at the latest in early spring of 56, Cato headed back towards Rome. His journey took several months and was only concluded in the summer of 56, probably between May and June. The accounts offered by Plutarch and some other sources, like Valerius Maximus and Velleius Paterculus, allow us to reconstruct Cato's path through Rome, through the city of Rome. So even if technically speaking this was not a triumph, it actually closely resembled the triumph celebrated by Pompey again in September 61, so 5 years before, and also recalled the spectacular entrance in Rome that Lucius Aemilius Paulus had made when he came back from Greece in 167 BC. As the latter, as Aemilius Paulus, Cato also went up the Tiber, so it was like a naval triumph. He reached Rome's military port, the Navalia, located at the southwestern edge of the Campus Martius. From there, he went on to the Forum, where the booty was deposited in the public aerarium by the Temple of Saturn. The follow-ups of Cato's arrival in Rome are not too much related to our Cypriot interests, but rather refer to the usual clashes of the Roman political arena. What we should ask ourselves to conclude is what happened to Cyprus after its annexation and confiscation, supported by Clodius and carried out by Cato? The early history of the Roman province of Cyprus is not at all clear to reconstruct. Once again, only by combining literary and epigraphical sources and archaeological, it is possible to suggest a tentative chronology of the Romanization process of the island under the administrative point of view. It is likely that since early 50 CE, but on the basis of some laws dating back to the spring-summer of 58, Cilicia and Cyprus constituted two distinct provinces from a geographical perspective, but were united under the command of a single person. In a recent article, the German historian Claudia Thiersch has properly spoken about a double province, Doppelprovinz in German. So the first consul who was in charge of the two territories was Publius Cornelius Lentulus Pinter, followed by Clodius's brother. This is also interesting. Clodius's elder brother, Appius Claudius Pulcher, and finally by Cicero. As pointed out by the American historian Corey Brennan, Cyprus was probably governed in a minimalist fashion, meaning without the physical presence of the proconsuls on the island and without the quartering of Roman troops, and by collecting not too much tax revenue. Neither Appius Claudius nor Cicero ever set foot on the island, and that was no doubt fine to the Cypriots. The only certain thing we know that Appius did regarding Cyprus, this is a very well-known episode, was to allow the negotiator Marcus Captius to be appointed as prefect of cavalry to collect certain private debts from the town of Salamis, with a huge and almost interest rate of 48%, if I remember correctly. So Cicero had to order Captius off when he succeeded Appius Claudius. He ordered Captius off the island in response to a petition from the Salaminians. And he also tried to restore order to Cyprus by delegating the quarrels of Roman citizens to a prefect named Quintus Volusius. Yet the first actual quaestor to make it to Cyprus were probably Gaius Sextilius Rufus in 49 BC, after Cicero's departure from Cilicia. It is possible, this is interesting, that at the time the island was governed by another proconsul named Lucius Caelius Tamphilus, whose name is attested by a newly interpreted inscription from Old Paphos. But the exact chronology of his appointment is unknown. In the end, Caesar decided that administering Cyprus was too much trouble, more trouble than it was worth, and promised to restore the island to Ptolemaic rule in 47, just a decade after annexation. So this first annexation only lasted 10 years. And then a new period in Cypriot history began, the so-called condominium between the last Ptolemies, at first Arsinoe IV and her brother Ptolemy XIII, but then above all Cleopatra, Cleopatra VII, our Cleopatra, and the Romans. So they were managing the island together, first Caesar, and then his murderer, and eventually Mark Antony, of course. In recent times, some French scholars, such as Jean-Baptiste Caillat and Anaïs Michel, have finally begun to address this most interesting span of time, the 40s and 30s BC in Cyprus, which in my opinion still deserve closer scrutiny. But this is a topic for a future research and a future talk. Thank you very much for your attention.
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much, Lorenzo, for coming along today and sharing a really in-depth and wonderful history of those very early years of the Roman control of Cyprus. For those of us who work in Neo-Paphos, these administrative and political decisions have a very interesting knock-on effect in the way that the city develops and its urban kind of changes in this kind of late Roman Republican period that have yet to be investigated. And it's through highlighting how complicated and complex and rich this area of history is, we'll start developing more research questions that we can, get into the archaeology to determine what's actually going on in the ground and how this is affecting the development of the town. So I really like to thank Lorenzo for a wonderful talk today, but also the Department of Classics and Ancient History, who have ensured Lorenzo has been able to come back and visit us. Lorenzo actually visited us just before the pandemic hit and just started developing a new program to work on some of the collections here at the university. We were very fortunate to have one of Lorenzo's students, Ludovico, join us last year to work on the Latin epigraphy of Sir Charles Nicholson. And I really hope that this is just the beginning of seeing Lorenzo around the museum, and we're going to be developing a much larger project to kind of publish some of our material based on this relationship. So thank you so much to Cato Welch and the department for organising Lorenzo to come along, and is going to be a really wonderful kind of next stage for the epigraphy collection here at the Nicholson in the Chau Museum. As many of you know, we don't do a formal question and answer, so please come and have a chat with Lorenzo. And if you've got any questions, join us, and hopefully just a small token of our appreciation for you, Lorenzo. So thank you so much.